So welcome again to the Urban Models seminar. Thank you very much for joining us today. So you probably know by now, so it's the final session of this seminar. We've been hosting one session per month for a year, over the past year, since October 2021. And today we have a session that's a bit different from what we had over the past session. So if you want to see what we've been doing, we've got the recordings of every session of the seminar that is online. So we've got video recordings of each of the session with each of the model described by our speakers. So you can see them on the YouTube channel Urban Model Seminar series that you can see on the left. And we are also in the process of editing those video recording into audio recordings. So it's not as long, and it's selected fragments of the seminars, and it's in a podcast format called Unforcing Influence that you can find on Spotify. So it's really nice for us to see you again. So by us, I mean Ruta and myself. Because over the summer we've started working on this podcast, and also we prepared this session, which is a discussion session where we're not looking at one model in particular. So you can see here in the slide all of the models that were addressed during this series, and most of the speakers that will be here today to discuss them and their relationships. But today we want to get a bit of a step back and look at the initial question that interested us in the first place in this series, which is looking at the circulation of analytical urban models. So we know that there is a literature on the circulation of, for example, planning models and design models and urban policies, for example. We have some ideas of how they move, not just as a circulation of ideas, but also a circulation of professionals and tools that then diffuse and spread some of the models from city to city. But in terms of analytical urban models, that is statistical models or simulation models, how we represent cities and how we think about them, we thought there was a gap here. And so we invited the people listed on this slide and a couple more to discuss all of the models here. And they focused on one model. And today we want to have them talk to each other and talk with you to try to reveal some of the similarities and differences between the circulation, the creation, and the circulation of all of those models. So today I want to introduce, briefly introduce, but mostly thank the speakers who have accepted to come back for this discussion. So I think we might expect a couple more, but that's uncertain at this point. But I really want to thank the ones that are here. So we've got the first presenter, Denise Pumin, who presented the central place theory and Kristalla's model. We've got Justin Deloy, who is here as well, who presented Alonso's model in November last year. We've got Cécile Tanier, who talked about fractals and fractal models in urban study. And we've got Ron Boschma, who presented evolutionary economic geography. All of their presentation is actually part of the podcast that it's already released. And we might also have the contributions of Professor Batty and Samrita Sarkar, who presented a Forrester urban dynamics model for Michael Batty and utilitarian models and urban resource allocation for Samrita Sarkar. So just a bit more context from me before we dive into this discussion. So as I was saying, today we find the linkages, the similarities, and the differences in how these models were created, were built, and diffused, and how the context, by context, I mean the personal context, but also disciplinary context, international context, played a role in shaping what is inside the model and how the model has been received and used in urban studies. And so we will focus on three things that we'll present in a minute. But first, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the genesis of this project. So the main idea, as I said, was to question how analytical urban models circulate. Is there a difference between planning models and how they spread from city to city, and the difference with analytical urban models, you could think that because they are translated in mathematical language or simulation models, maybe they're more transparent and there would be less biased in the diffusion. I think everything that we've heard over the past year suggests that that isn't the case, that a lot of very contingent elements of context have been embedded in the hypothesis, the assumptions of the models that we looked at, and also in how they were received across countries, across disciplinary boundaries. And so that raised a lot of new questions. So the initial question of this series of seminars was really, what are the unforeseen consequences of model simplifications on how we represent and act on cities? And I think we've really moved over the different sessions from this question, which is really not very easy to address, to another question, which is, what are the elements that really influence model building and model circulation? So how does a model become a classic, and what happens when a model becomes a classic? What kind of assumptions are forgotten or unchecked along the way? And I think we also have started to think about how do we break free from some models that have become classic but probably shouldn't, or should be revisited, or should be updated to new urban situations. So that is what we are going to talk about today. So the three themes that we are going to look at are the questions of what makes an analytical urban model successful, and by successful I mean widely used, widely discussed, contested, well-known, taught in urban studies courses, for example. A second theme of discussion will be what I just mentioned: how do we break free from models? When are they too cumbersome and have to be adjusted, and their conclusions always discussed and taken with caution? How do we get further? Like, do we contest models or maybe adapt them for future use and future context? And then a discussion on the circulation itself. So through geographical language, through disciplinary boundaries. So we're going to look at the different models and compare what happens when a model crosses language or a disciplinary boundary. Does it bring more confusion or more cross-fertilization? So with the help of the different models, we hope that it will be interesting. And we think that this conversation can bring a little insight by comparing them, because we've had so far like a juxtaposition of different stories about different models. And when you listen to all of them one after the other, you start to pick some similarities, some oppositions. So we really want to talk to the experts and the speakers who've spent time really digging into those models in detail to see if they've got the same ideas about circulations of urban models as a whole. So right now, I would like to ask our speakers if they could introduce themselves in a very short way, and also if they could tell us in a few sentences what their model was about, what the models they discussed was about, and how it fits with the overall series, because you might have seen other episodes, and how do you think your model relates to the other models? Is it very specific and you think it's a very specific case studies, or you found a lot of similarities with other models? So maybe we can start with the chronological order of the seminars. So if you don't mind starting with the first one, Denise, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Clémentine and Ruta, for preparing this discussion so well. So I am Denise Pumin. I am a geographer in Paris, and I was responsible of presenting the Crystaller model of central place theory, which I think has the originality of being the very one that propose a model for the whole set of cities, so at the level of a system of cities, whereas most of the other models that have been studied refer mainly to one city at a time. And the other peculiarity is the age of this model, which was elaborated in 1933, but has antecedents in the 19th century as well. And then the circulation has been very, very general, and many misunderstandings have arisen because partly of the ambiguities within the model itself, which is not completely a sound mathematical derivation in its geometry, but many confusions arose because of the confusing the theoretical principles that are included in the model and what were called special models of central place theory. And the third source of controversies around that model were the peculiarities in the academic and political trajectory of Walter Christaller himself. And so some people reject the model and the theory because of strong discrepancies with the political attitude of the person. So it's also a peculiar story. Sorry for having been so long in recalling all that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's 2-3 minutes. It's very fine. Thank you very much. I think we'll go on to Justin, who was the second one to present.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. So I'm Justin Delois. I'm a geographer by training, and I teach economic geography at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. The model I presented last year in November was the Alonso model of monocentric city. So it's an economic model that describes how morphological functionality and decreasing population density profiles emerge from assumption of households' behavior on the housing market and the necessity to commute toward the city center to work and get a wage. With respect to this seminar series, I think the interesting point of the monocentric model is that it has been used a lot by geographers as well, sometimes with I would not say misunderstanding, but a partial understanding of the assumption and the goals of the model as it was initially developed. And I think we'll have some times later today to discuss about that.
Thank you very much. Can we all go on to you, Cécile? I think you were the next.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Sorry, my video camera does not work. So the model I presented in the seminar were the fractal models for analysis and simulation. Its specificity regarding the other types of models is its intrinsic geometric nature. What could I say? It close to, in some aspect, it joins fractal models in general, join central place models, because some scholars have proposed fractal central place systems. So I have discussed this in my presentation. The main ambiguity or misunderstanding about fractal models is related to the fact that the fractal dimension is comes from a statistical estimation, and so a lot of people think that a fractal law is synonymous of a scaling law. But in fact, it is not really the case. It is the case, we could say, on a statistical point of view, but the foundations of fractal models are not a simple scaling law, but a self-similarity in space. So I suggest that it is the main misunderstanding about using the use of fractal models. So it's not really widespread in planning practices, but we could discuss this later on, perhaps.
Yes, please. That would be nice.
Mm.
So I have the bad news. So Ron Boschma had to leave for a personal emergency, but Mike Batty joined us. So we've got another speaker. Mike, do you mind introducing yourself and the model you presented during the seminar, just saying what you think is the specificity of that model in comparison with the other ones, please?
Yes, I'm Mike Batty from CASA in UCL in London, and I'm a bit late because I've been watching the funeral, right, like the other 60 million people in Britain at the moment. So, which is a very splendid affair, in fact, to me, amazing sort of pomp and circumstance. Anyway, notwithstanding that, I presented Forrester's work. Just to quickly rehearse what I said back when I gave the talk. Basically, urban models really began in the mid-1950s as land use transport models in the United States. And one of the kind of key criterion was that they were cross-sectional comparative static models in economic terms, in macroeconomic terms. They were equilibrium models, and dynamics was not really included. Now, this was not because dynamics was considered unimportant by people who worked with them at that time, and I began to work with them as a immediate postgraduate in the mid-1960s, and so I met many of the people who originally developed those models, and most of those people thought that dynamics was important, but there were lots of reasons why one couldn't really build dynamic models, in the sense that data was very poor, and still is to some extent, and the whole notion about modeling processes as opposed to structures of form, as it were, rather than function, I suppose, in some sense, was really much easier to consider and to enable. And what happened was that these models started in the mid-50s, and a wide variety of them have been developed by the late 60s. And onto the scene came this book from Jay Forrester called Urban Dynamics, which was in many senses a very iconoclastic sort of view about cities. First of all, Forrester was an engineer at MIT and had developed industrial dynamics, which really was the idea of looking at firms, at the processes of supply chains, if you like, in firms and so on. In conversation with the mayor of Boston, he was quite an influential guy, Forrester, they decided to apply this urban dynamic, this industrial dynamics to Boston itself. One of the kind of key problems was that there was no more data than there ever had been, which was very little. And so consequently, the model was sort of invented by Forrester. That was the first point. And then secondly, it was applied to his version of Boston, which really was the inner city and the CBD, rather than the sort of sprawl surrounding it in some sense. So it was non-spatial. And it was a very iconoclastic model, but it threw dynamics onto the agenda in many senses. And it was really quite different. Now, one of the things that Clémentine said in this seminar, in having this seminar, was that how were these models different from one another? Well, to some extent, one of the things that I've thought about over the years is that many of these models reflect the personalities and the idiosyncrasies of the model builders. And certainly this was the case in terms of Forrester's model. Nobody else was doing what Forrester was doing in this sense. But if you look back at the standard land use transport models, which sort of all vary to some extent with spatial interaction, economic base theory, input output, and so on, these models were designed by people who had certain views about the system, which were not all the same. And I think one of the key things in urban models is that people's personalities, idiosyncrasies, background, and so on is really reflected in the model in that sense. And of course, back 40 years or more ago, I think there was a feeling that maybe many of these models would be very similar, and there would be a theory, if you like, built around them. But in fact, that's not turned out to be the case. In fact, there's a great proliferation of different variants of these models in that sense. So it's the idiosyncrasies and the culture, if you like, of the model builders and all of the culture of the data and so on that really impresses me now when I look back at those models and look at how people are developing new models. So those are the points I'd like to make, and they're very much reflected in the Forrester model. Pass back to you, Clémentine.
Thank you very much. And it's a perfect transition to the first topic of discussion that I wanted to submit to you, because my first suggestions of a discussion between you was to try and identify what makes a model. I said successful. It's not necessarily a success as in being rewarded and etc., but a model that is useful, that is used at the very least, that is inspiring others to use it, to discuss it, to adapt it to different case studies. And so I think throughout the discussions, we've had some idea of elements that can favor a model to spread, to talk to other people, and to be reused. So I think, and that's where I would really like you to intervene with the examples of the model you presented or others that you're familiar with, of course. But it seems that models that addressed a very clear and defined issue were also more favorable to be reused because they're not confusing different topics. But for example, the concentric city model, they've got, well, had a very clear point. It's doing one thing and it's used for that very one thing. Maybe Forrester is a bad example of that, but I think for the different models, that could be a topic for discussion. Is it something that also addresses a clear issue in a very complex setting? So, for example, we had the presentation of shelling. So it's a very simple mechanism that is supposed to address mechanism segregation, urban segregation, that is very complex and that can have many causes, but the model is inspiring because it does it with one very simple hypothesis. So that could be one way. And then what Mike just mentioned, I think a lot of elements of context also can play in favor or against the diffusion of the model. So that could be, for example, personal context, so elements of personalities, as Mike mentioned, but that could also be their personal social networks, so being associated with the mayor of Boston in the case of Forrester, or working with the Nazis in the case of Christaller might have different effect on how the model is received and later on discussed. But there could be also element of institutional context, and then maybe well, as in other disciplines, being part of a dominant discipline in economics, for example, might do more for the model compared to the model coming from a smaller department or like a less dominant discipline, let's say. And there could be also national and international events that could play a role in this trajectory of the model. So from the point of view of the model you presented and other models that you have in mind, would you be interested in discussing this proposition of what makes a model successful in its diffusion trajectory and being used and reused? Whoever wants to start is welcome, and I'm invited the audience also to intervene if you want to at some point. If I could suggest the presenters to unmute themselves and start when they want to start, that would be nice.
If I may, there are, as you said, contextual circumstances explaining the success of some models. But all the models that have had a big success are, I think, relatively simple. So simplicity would be perhaps the generic property of the models that have been widely used. Is if at the same time they have a certain capacity for synthesis and may be applied in many locations. Another reason for the success is the transparency of the hypotheses that are included, and this is a condition for the some misunderstandings that can happen later on if the hypotheses that are circulating are not exactly those which were intended by the creator of the model. And of course, the transportability of the model is also convenient for ensuring the success of the diffusion. That's what I wanted to add on this point. Thank you.
And just to make a precision, so by transportability, you mean how it can be communicated, or like the fact that it could be a very...
Yes, the model should not depend on a given location or size or something too specific. Because, for instance, if you consider the McGee model of urbanism, about something including rural and urban areas within it's the same part, it is not so transportable to older settlement systems that have not been built over ages on this peculiarity. So what is the name of his model? This kind of urbanism?
in Indonesia?
Huh? In Indonesia, yes, but there is a specific name which I forget now.
Yeah.
Oh, it will come back. No, don't worry.
Oh, Terry, okay.
Perhaps I can add something about the case of fractal models as an illustration. First of all, the success is very different in the academic world and in the applications for urban or regional planning or urban design. So for me, it's crucial to separate these two aspects. And for instance, in the case of the fractal analysis models, they are widely used in the academic world, not only in geography, in economic, in physics, but also in medicine and so on. So many applications are done based on the estimation or the calculation of one or another type of fractal dimension. But the fact is that in planning, it is not used. Although the fractal dimension is a good a complement to the density measures, but it's not so easy to estimate properly a fractal dimension. It's not well known. The theory is not well known among the urban practitioners, and so it's not used.
Yeah, let me just say something about which follows that point to some extent. One of the reasons why the first wave of land use transportation models was developed was largely because in the United States, the car ownership had grown enormously, really, from the interwar years. And the interstate highway system was being put in place in the mid-50s. And cities in the United States were sprawling. So land use transportation models were used very much from the point of view of policy, that one of the kind of key drivers was the fact that these models were to be used in practice, that the theory was very rudimentary and so on. I mean, although the theories, of course, do relate to things like the Alonso model that Justin talked about and so on, and also gravitational models and etc. So these models were very applied in a practical context. And at the end of the 60s, in the early 70s, Douglas B. Lee, who was an assistant professor at Berkeley in planning, wrote this article, Requiem for Large-Scale Models. And he more or less said in the article that everything about them was wrong, basically. They were addressing the wrong policy issues. There was really no theory. The databases were terrible. And basically, they didn't work in that sense. And they certainly, in some sense, got a very bad press once they were built in practice. And it looked like the death knell. So his paper, Requiem for Large-Scale Models, really pronounced the end, if you like, of those models. Interestingly enough, in some sense, they did go into a kind of nuclear winter to some extent, but gradually began to get resurrected. And the paper by Michael Wegener in about 1990 basically looks at what had been happening since the 60s and had identified that many of these models were being sort of still developed in the bigger planning agencies were beginning to develop them. And then since then, they've sort of come back onto the agenda. But in some senses, the difficulties still remain, that they don't really address some of the kind of key planning policy issues that we face, certainly in the Western world. I mean, questions now of housing affordability and so on. But what they do address, which is a sort of constant in all of this, is they do address transportation. They address movement in some sense. They're central to this question of movement, which is not going to go away because even if we're all internet shopping and so on, we're still moving around. We're still in this particular context, and we have technologies that enable us to move differently. So to some extent, this is a set of models which, the LUTI models, the land use transportation models, which are not well adapted to practice still, but nevertheless have a role because urban planners in practice have to deal with transportation in some sense, with movement in that sense. So this is an interesting question about the applicability of models and their relevance in that sense, that they're not relevant in every sense. There are still aspects of them that are problematic. Now, in the interim, other models have emerged. So dynamics has been tackled by cellular automata models. Cellular automata models are not really very good at handling stuff like spatial interaction and so on in that context, but they do deal with the dynamics of change. And then, of course, agent-based models loosen the whole thing up in the sense that there are some quite well-established agent-based models in transport, such as MatSims and so on. Sim mobility, etc. But those models are extremely difficult to build, but they are being built in practice. So there's a sort of love-hate relationship between how good the model is and whether or not it can be used in practice and how it is being used. So the picture is not as simple as saying that, you have a model that doesn't really work very well for certain circumstances and then you pronounce the death knell of it. Often those models get manipulated in different ways and used in different aspects in different ways, etc. So it's a kind of mixed picture, really, I think, in that sense.
If I may, in this respect, Mike, one could mention the question of transportability of models between disciplines.
Yes.
Comparing a crystalline model with a zip rule, and Crystal used to say that zip was simply playing with numbers, so no interest in this statistical distribution, because of course no geographical theory behind. Whereas on the contrary, the zip distribution has been taken as a more generic model by many disciplines other than geography to deal later on with the distribution of city size. It's a very good example.
Very much so. I mean, transportability, I think, is again very key, and one of the reasons why models continue to use certain sorts of models is because they are reasonably transportable, and they're probably simple at the same time. So most aggregate land use transport models tend to be relatively simple, and therefore there's an immediate critique of that. And at the same time, the data for them, the aggregate data, is not difficult to get, notwithstanding the point I was making about dynamic data. As we begin to make those models more detailed, it becomes more and more difficult to get the data in that sense. Urban Sim is a classic example, I think.
So that's quite interesting, and I think it joins the transportability across disciplines, joins what we've seen in most of the model presentations, is also that a lot of the model builders were themselves either polymath or coming from another field and entering urban studies, or creating new disciplines, like Justin mentioned, Alonso being at the start of this new department of regional science. So do you think that would be very specific to urban studies, being a very interdisciplinary sort of field, or that would work for any analytical model in general? That's a very open question.
I may start here. Well, it's true that many urban questions are by essence transdisciplinary. It's very hard to take only one disciplinary perspective on cities, and I think it is why researchers in urban studies are maybe more pay more attention to what's happening in other disciplines, because somehow it's always relevant to your own researchers. And I think it goes back to what you said about the success of a model depending on the fact that it addresses one key point that can be understood by other disciplines. And this issue needs to have an interest in those other disciplines as well. For example, if I think back to the monocentric city model, I think that for William Alonso, when he built that model, it was really about bringing space into those economic models. But the same way, geographers, quantitative geographers, saw that as a way of using those tools of economics and bringing economics to the geographical reflection about space. So those are just two sides of the same coin, and it's important in that way that a model can be perceived differently by different disciplines, and each one finds something that is useful. But for this multidisciplinary perspective to emerge, the context is also important. So you just mentioned it. At the time the model was developed, regional science was, I think, essentially composed by economists, but there were also welcoming quantitative geographers who maybe at that time had more difficulties to find colleagues in the geographical departments, and so they were there, and there was this network of people where cross-fertilization could happen.
Thank you. Rita? Yep.
Yeah, I'm wondering, does the technological progress contributed to the success of the models? Because some of them are very much related with computers and the capacity and data. So can you see some links? Was it helpful for some models? Or I remember Michael was a bit skeptical about computers and the ability to predict the future, that only works as the tool.
Yeah, I'm not over convinced that, I mean, to some extent, everything we're talking about is dependent upon having digital computers to be able to compute things and manipulate things and so on. So in that sense, you know, we live in, you know, these things began basically when the age when we were all beginning to use computers in that sense. So I don't think they can be easily separated out at that level. That's a very generic level. But in terms of the success of the models, the structure of many of the models that have been mentioned so far this afternoon, in those terms, I'm not over convinced that computers and technological progress, which to the fact that you know, computers have been miniaturized decade after decade, and they're now everywhere. And to a large extent, we don't have the problems of capacity and limits on memory size and speed that we used to have, which were problematic. But I'm not sure that the models themselves are particularly related to technological progress of that kind in terms of ever bigger, ever faster computers in that sense. The questions of what is in these models is to some extent independent, I think, of computational capacity. Of course, you know, having said that, you can always point to cases that are not that. I mean, back to the Forrester model. I mean, Forrester basically developed this language called systems dynamics, which was a sort of special language to look at the kind of dynamic problems he had. And to some extent, it was very much dependent on computer power at that particular point in time, what he actually developed. Although if you look at the essence of his model, computers, you know, what he included in it and what he excluded was nothing really to do with, you know, the rate of technological progress. It was related to, you know, what was happening in Boston back in the 1960s and so on. So yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical about the extent to which computers have driven, you know, this this general field that we're talking about.
If I may just add something on this point, but it may be very specific to the economic models, such as the monocentric city model of Alonso. I think that for those analytical model, yeah, the computer power has made quite some change in the sense that you know that economists, when they develop models focusing on equilibria, they like to have analytical model with a solution. But the way geographers have been working with these models, they've been relying on simulations, taking some freedom with the strict notion of economic equilibrium. And this has enabled to explore new dimensions of these models, to add complexity to these models in order, still in a very theoretical motivations, in order to provide new insight about these models. So it's true that it's not about the cutting edge computing power that one may reach, but the fact that computing power is now more widespread. I think it has been very useful for researchers in general to get those models back and improve them and understand them the way they wanted to. In the same way, I remember a few years ago teaching with my colleagues Geoffrey Caruso and Rémi Lemoy a lecture to geography students, and it was about urban economics, but with simulations. And instead of focusing on the mathematical aspects of the models, we were teaching exactly the same models, but using simulation models. And it was so a simulation implementation of the same model. This is what I mean. And it was very insightful for the students. So this may be another way that the the widespread of computer power has enabled to revisit those models and to maybe for some students and new generation of researchers and urban policymakers to grasp the understanding of these models.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave the space for people in the audience to intervene. So you can either write something in the chat or open your microphone. I'm going to give you a little bit of time.
Let me just say that I agree with what Justin has said. To some extent, it's almost impossible to disentangle, computational progress from, what we do and how we develop these models and have developed them in that sense. And to try and involve somebody else in the call, we're actually developing a land use transport model for the UK called Quant. And we're adding a walking network. Now, Ivan Schlosser, who is also on the call, is working on that project or has been working on the project. Are you alive, Ivan? I can see you there. I mean, and we couldn't do... Yeah,
yes, I am. Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
It might be a bit noisy in my background, but I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you couldn't do what you're doing on Quant without modern computers, because we're building a walking network for the UK. So we're using OpenStreetMap and a variety of things. And so in some senses, everything we do is dependent, is relative to what computational capacity we've got at this point in time. I think the point I was making earlier on that whether we include walking or not is not particularly a question of computing or technological progress, although the way we're doing it is very much dependent on computers. I don't know whether you want to say anything, Ivan, about that question, right? Trying to involve the audience.
Well, I guess the tools we use change a lot over time, but the final aim, not necessarily. So yeah, it's about it's more about the tools themselves than the ambitions and the methods and the reasons why we use them, I would say. But yeah, definitely I can, like, sitting in the countryside with a good internet connection, do things that 50 years ago would probably require like a bunch of, like a group of NAS engineers and giant warehouses with huge transistors to do very simple things I do now. So yeah, of course. And yeah, technology is the state of technology has a great influence on how we work, but not necessarily the final aim of what we do.
Thank you. Unless there is another contribution here, I wanted to suggest also maybe another way that the developments in computational power interacts with the diffusion of those models is also with the issues of validating the model, or at least evaluating their capacity to reproduce the initial problem that is addressed to the model. And I'm thinking here that, for example, I saw a paper on Forrester saying that since we can implement the model in your own machine and trying to verify the assumptions and how the model worked, they've shown that it doesn't really work. Like it's not supposed to work. It's not validated against any data. For example, it shouldn't be successful in some sense. And so that brings me to the second type of discussion I wanted to bring in, is how do we, once we have this information, Forrester is still influential. So how do we break free? How do we break the influence of models that then are shown to be not useful anymore, so that they can have, they've brought some insight already, they were useful maybe for some purpose, but at some point, like Samrita was arguing with utilitarian models or the utility maximizing, it's been shown that it's bringing counter intuitive results, but it's still used in almost every model that she was showing for cost benefit analysis, etc. So how do we then change the trajectory of urban modeling away from models that are shown to have done their job and that shouldn't influence how we represent and plan cities anymore? So who has some ideas on this? Or was it not very clear?
I may start with a let's say a bold statement to see whether it generates some reactions or not. But I don't think you break free from those old models, and I don't really think you should neither, because the way I perceive it is that they had to be wrong in a sense for future models to be right. If you see what I mean, maybe it's a bias of the modern academic world to try to always design something new, but I still like the old way of doing science, which is really anchoring on what has been done in the past and progressing small step by small step. And in that sense, there is no real need of getting free of those old models, but it's more about understanding them to be able to focus on what we should improve in the future. And in that way, they are very, very important, because otherwise we will every time be reinventing the same kind of models. So yeah, this is my general point on this question, and I would like to hear what the other think.
I would, yes, I fully agree with Justin that we don't need to destroy or to forget completely the old models, but the scientific strategy is always to transform them, to increment, to make hybridations also. And I think that the capacity, the technological capacities participate in our ability to improve the quality of model. And for instance, you mentioned cellular automata. I think that without the big capacity of computation that we have today, we would still complain and make a requiem for the large models. So and Clémentine Cottineau mentioned also the validation step, which is very, very important. And so what you have conceived about making the biography of the use and interest in those models, I think is a good way to associate to the description of the model, because it is part of the experiment and scientific, the progressivity of the scientific construction of models that can be satisfying for a longer time and become better. Okay.
Anyone else on the breaking free? So we're at the point of not breaking free, but I guess, okay, maybe the idea was there might be a point where a model has finished this course and maybe like I don't know. So your idea is they should all be kept alive, and but to build better models, is it with increments from the different models, or at some point for example, the monocentric assumption is not fit for current context? Well, what would be your thought on this? For example, Justin, a very common criticism to the Alonso model nowadays, saying that, well, most cities are polycentric, and what does the model help to understand this? So what would you say, that it's useful to then see the discrepancy between what this model predicts and what current cities, how current cities are? Or would you say that, well, there's just a few adaptation to make to the model to make it fit for the purpose of modeling polycentric cities, or the model that should be developed for polycentric city just is a combination of different Alonso's model? What would be your answer to this criticism?
Well, it's a very relevant question. I've been asked this before in conferences, when I got feedbacks from reviewers, from papers, etc. And it's always coming back, and it's very, very interesting. The way I see it, as cities are really complex objects, even when we talked about the city being more monocentric or polycentric, we are already talking about some abstraction level of cities. And the monocentric city model was monocentric because at that time, I think the motivation was about the urban sprawl. It was the main goal of this model. This was what they wanted to study. And in that sense, as in the analytic model, simplification is really important. Well, it's convenient to discuss urban sprawl as a circle, or even it was in one dimension at that time, but it's easier to figure out the city as a circle that can be larger or smaller. So it was for me a convenient assumptions. Now, there are other thematics that you may want to study in cities, especially, for example, the creation of subcenters, of either subcenters maybe of jobs, of housing, amenities, any kind of subcenters. And then, of course, you don't necessarily need to go back to the monocentric city model. It's really about what you want to study, and is it relevant to your study or not? I think some aspects of the model are really very important. So the relationship between the transport and the rent that you're able to pay for your housing is kind of ubiquitous. You will find it in any kind of model, even in the more applied simulation urban model, you will find this relationship hidden somewhere, although it's not called the monocentric city model of Alonso. And that's fine. That's the way I think this model is used and improved, but it all depends on your research question. And most of the time, I think you will need to change some part of it and add some parts of it, because this model was designed to answer one specific question, and it shouldn't be used too easily to answer other kind of questions. So for me, it's just a matter of perspective. If we are, I mean, in 100 years, we should still talk about this model because it provides something useful. But if we are only talking about this model, then there is something wrong. You see what I mean? That's how I imagine urban science and geography in general should evolve, keeping those old contributions that are still relevant somehow.
My understanding of what happened in the 60s with the invention of or Alonso's development of the model. I mean, several people came together. Martin Beckmann, for example, wrote about the monocentric model, the Alonso model, back in the mid-50s. And a variety of other people developed it at the same time, Edwin Mills and Richard Muth and so on. And my understanding of what Alonso did, I mean, he was the first, as you know, I mean, who gave a theoretically elegant exposition of it in terms of microeconomic theory. My understanding was that the mathematics, the theory that he used was from economics was such that it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to generalize it to a polycentric or a more than one center system, basically. and that various people, you know, Papa Giorgio and people like that, tried a bit, but never really managed to crack it in some sense. Now, I'm not enough of an urban economist or a mathematical economist to know how one might go about that, but the received wisdom appeared to be that it was not possible to do it. And the number of people who worked on it was relatively small within economics, and therefore it was sort of left on one side. Now, that's not really to say that there might ultimately be, within 100 years, Justin, maybe, there may be some insights in urban economics that would enable one to generalize it. But you said this a moment ago, that where the progress has probably been is switching from the kind of the elegant theory, the mathematical theory, over towards simulation. So many of the simulation models we've been referring to take for granted that cities will be polycentric in some sense, and indeed in land use transport models that there are certain dynamic versions which do lead to polycentricity, in the sense that places become more attractive over time. Their accessibility reaches a point where, you know, you do get sort of edge cities and hubs being developed, basically. So in some senses, and I think this is a very good point, reinforcing what you said about the fact that within 100 years, we'll still have the Alonso model. It'll still be there. It may well be that the right sort of formality has been developed to be able to generalize it to a polycentric structure. I don't know, but nevertheless, the model as it stands, I think, will still remain as a kind of a pillar, because it is a very elegant exposition of the way, you know, land price, rent, as it were, and space and distance and so on combine really in the city.
Maybe can I add an idea to all this? It's about the fact that when doing a model, either for research purposes or for applied or practice purposes, some facts that are well known. For instance, the strong emergence that characterizes all social systems that function in space. So the strong emergence, it means that all the individuals have collective references that emerge from their behaviors, and they observe, all individuals observe those references to adapt their behavior to this. So the strong emergence, it is well known, it is recognized, but in many applications, in many case studies, it is not useful to model that, to model this. So the fact that a model is realistic or not, good or not, that it does not take into account all the knowledge about the model systems, it's not really crucial and really important. The most important is the model appropriate regarding that or that question.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Is there a question from the audience before we move on to our third discussion topic? Going to leave a few seconds for hesitant people. If not, then I would like to introduce the third discussion topic that we will have until the end of the seminar, which brings us back to really the idea of like the circulation of models, because this is not a blank space in urban studies. There's a lot of literature, as I mentioned in the beginning, on how planning models or planning theories, for example, spread in the academic, but also in the practice world. So there has been some findings about, well, the circulation of ideas, the circulation of actors, through which channels, for example, training, seminars, etc. Some models then can spread more than others. And I think one of the main findings is that there are also relations of power. So of course, as part of this literature, there's a lot of questioning of like models from the global north spreading to the global south in terms of, for example, urban planning models, how they are adapted on site. I think one way we could reuse these findings in the case of analytical urban models, that I think we find some of those dynamics of power. For example, when we mention whether it's Alonso's model or Forrester, in the cases that are here, we talk about models that have been developed by academics in the US in rather dominant disciplines in the academic field that were English speaking. So all of these are attributes that facilitate really the circulation of those models, because maybe, and I think there are cases, and those are the really fascinating cases where some models have been developed somewhere else, but have not managed to cross boundaries because they were not translated in time, or because they were not recognized even when they were brought to the scene. So Denise has been part of finding this theory from the 19th century that precedes Christoller's model, but really was written in French in an encyclopedia and wasn't recognized as the first model of the same case study. So the last discussion topic was really about bringing those ideas of language and disciplines and boundaries that have to be crossed. Would you say there are some specificities of analytical urban models in this circulation, or is it just another, I don't know, scientific examples of relationships of power? But for example, is there a specificity, and we could think about the fact that analytical urban models have an additional language, which is usually either programming language or mathematics, which could help them diffuse a bit more than just narratives, for example. So this third discussion topic was to see what are your thoughts based on the model that you presented on these issues of translation and well, transfer between disciplines. And I think it's interesting that we've got a lot of French-speaking academics, so we should be, and I see in the audience a lot of people with non-English sounding names, so probably very conscious of the extra barrier in diffusing your work when you're not native British speaker, English speaker. Denise, we can't hear you there.
Yes, you can hear me now. Sorry. You mentioned this discovery of Christoller theory 1 century before. Another, the question of language may be one reason, but there is another one. In the encyclopedia by Reynaud, there is no graphical representation of the model. Jean Reynaud speaks about the distribution of activities and central places in hexagons, and small hexagons being embedded into larger ones and so on. So he described completely and he explains why it should be like that, because of the different level of services that are provided in those places, but he made no design. And paradoxically enough, I think that the success of Christoller's theory is its translation into maps and the ability of mentally compare this kind of maps with what people were observing in their own countries. This may have facilitated the circulation of the model. On the other hand, there were a few cul-de-sac in research because people tried to find and to measure the hexagons and concluded the theory is wrong since I didn't find the hexagon exactly, the exact patterns in the geometry of my network of central places. But of course, this was not invalidating the theory. It was already observed by crystallers that you may get different special patterns according to the local conditions and to the hypothesis about transportation system and so on. So both a simple graphic representation may help the circulation of the model, but also help to circulate false ideas or false attempts at fully understanding what the theory is in the model. And this is an interesting, something interesting between the theory and its representation that we also can find, for instance, in the discussions about the Schelling's model and so on.
Thanks, Denise. And I think at this point, probably we can think also of fractals as a very strong graphical representation that probably helped diffuse the theory of this French mathematician or French-speaking mathematician. Cécile, would you have an idea of this?
Yes, actually, the fact that fractals are beautiful, and so people like look at fractals, it's a good thing for this model to be known. But on the other side, in the field of urban planning and urban design, irregular and fragmented shapes, such as fractals, are not appropriate. They do not converge with the usual way urban planners and urban designers draw the city. And besides, the rules, the planning rules inscribed in the law, the official planning rules in general are based on the delineation of spatial entities where one type of development or another type of development is authorized. And those shapes, for instance, in local urban master plans, are intrinsically smooth, not fractal at all. And so it can be an aspect of fractal shapes that make for being not applied in the field of urban planning and urban design. It's a suggestion.
Is there any other comment on the language and disciplinary boundaries?
I have one. Actually, I was reflecting on what Cécile just said about fractals, and I had in mind that, of course, the mathematical formalism of analytical model can also be kind of medium to smooth communication between different people. But I think it's very important to distinguish the academic world from the applied world of urban planners, etc. Because in the academic world, from my personal experience, I tend to think that having the mathematical formalism was indeed smoothing differences between disciplines. Talking to economists essentially on my side, it was much simpler to reflect on a formalism that was clearly written down and then exchanging and see where the differences in view are coming from. But on the other end, this same mathematical formalism is sometimes a difficulty for urban planners and politicians to get the insights of the model. And usually when I think about my colleague economists, they tend to transmit the knowledge of the model using simple recommendations about how transport costs will influence the spreading of the city, those kind of things. So hiding the model may just communicating the simple results, if I may call them like that. And in my experience in geography, we tend to hide the same complexity in the simulation model, where really the result of the model in terms of prediction or at least projections, this is the kind of result that policy policymakers and urban planners are really they really enjoy it, because they can really grasp how it's going to help them to plan the city. So so I think, yeah, I was just thinking about that listening to Cécile. I think there is a huge difference between what can be a useful medium in the academic world and on the other hand, can sometimes be a barrier from the academic world to the applied world, if I may call it like that.
Yeah, and since Ron Boschman is not here, I just remember that in his presentation, he was very clear about this, how policymakers could benefit from this knowledge when he was talking about the evolutionary economic geography and how it helps to understand the diversification opportunities and economic capabilities of cities and regions. And yes, it was all related with the concepts of relatedness and complexity, and policy makers could actually play an important role by identifying the diversification opportunities and then thus helping the cities to strengthen their economy.
I think there's a big difference between different sorts of policymakers. Am I, whoops. Oh. No, what's happened here?
We can see you and hear you perfectly.
You can you see me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh. Well, I can't see myself. Okay, so let me just make a point. I was going to make a point that in terms of policymakers, there's some quite big difference between different sorts of policymakers. So, for example, a good deal of our work is related to a very standard system of policymaking that is basically built into all layers of government. I'm talking here about, urban planning, town and country planning, whatever you want to call it. And that's very different, I think, from economic policy making, which doesn't have that kind of, it doesn't have that local universality that the urban planning system does. So in some senses, we've always argued that our main role is to develop these models to make so that they can actually be used by urban planners in that sense, so that urban planners producing local and strategic plans in that sense and inform them in that way. And the big issue, I think, that many of us in our group sort of accept is that we need a much bigger proportion of resources applied to this translation function between the models and tools and their use in policy making. The much bigger resource allocation justification for that activity than to actually build the models in the first place. So I reckon we need 10 times as much resource to actually develop the, for want of a better word, the user interfaces, the way of actually translating these into a form where it can be useful in policy making. And I think that to look at policy making across the board in different contexts, economic policy making as well, as Ruth has just mentioned, I think that would be quite a fruitful thing to do in this field. It's not the main thing that one needs to do, but it's certainly an important issue about how we translate all of this stuff into different types of policy. Let me see if I can get my screen back. Where are we? We're on Zoom, aren't we? Oh yeah, okay, got it back. Sorry, I must have just flicked it. Okay.
Yes, indeed, I totally agree with you. And I will give to you 2 examples about the need for resources allocated to the diffusion of models from the academic world to the world of the practitioners. Usually when researchers create models to help to support spatial planning, so spatial planning decision support systems, usually they just try to show that their models can be applied and that urban planners and designers find their models interesting. That's what we have done with some fractal simulation models in the city of Besançon or the city of Lyon in France. And that's also what we have done with an individual-based simulation models, land use and transport integrated. And once we have shown that those models were applicable and were interesting for urban planning, we stopped. We did another research. We explored another research question, you see. So it's a specific work to diffuse and to communicate about the models created in the field of research, I think.
Thank you very much. We are really 3 minutes from the end of the seminar. So if someone from the audience had a pressing question for our presenters or a comment or a contribution, it's really now or never. So yeah, we see someone's finger, but is there such a comment or a contribution? Rita, have you had any questions in the chat? No. Then I think we can close this discussion. I want to thank again the 4 presenters we had today, the 8 or 9 presenters we had throughout the year for those really interesting conversation presentation, diving back into old models for the next 100 years. So I really want to say thank you to all of you, and hopefully have a good day after this.